James Rowe is a professor of political ecology and cultural, social, and political thought at the University of Victoria, and the author of a great book called Radical Mindfulness: Why Transforming Fear of Death is Politically Vital. Radical Mindfulness examines the root causes of injustice. There is a specific relationship that white settlers have to rectifying the historical and structural wrongs that we are fundamentally complicit with. And that's whether we like it or not. And there are a lot of people who believe these wrongs exist just in the past, and thus don't need to be dealt with by folks in the present, and conveniently feel that it's too far back to care. Well, that past is not past. And Rowe asks us on a philosophical and physical level why we carry a resistance to healing the historical and existential trauma we carry. One of the things that seems to interrupt the use of mindfulness to access and heal those scars is appropriation. Radical mindfulness talks about the corporate co-optation of mindfulness in really wonderful ways, stating that while there isn't any need for people to be Buddhist to benefit from meditation, naming and honoring the tradition is important to avoid appropriation. If we don't, we risk sidestepping a crucial component of that tradition, which is about transforming fear of death into a deep acceptance of earthly life, thereby reducing destructive behaviors, to quote the book. I'm not going to say that I was skeptical of the idea that fear of death might be the central cause of most structures of domination, most violence, most oppression, but I just couldn't fully wrap my head around what that meant. And radical mindfulness helped me understand the ways that fear of finitude drives a pathological commitment to a kind of immortalism, a commitment to preserving the nation, the corporation, the self, at the expense of others, or even at the expense of the earth itself. So I do think accepting death as part of the fullness of reality is politically vital, as James puts it. Because if we do recognize the flow of impermanence, or what Dominic Boyer has called the total, excessive, marvelous abundance of life-death, and he puts it in one word, we can possibly get to a place politically where we aren't as overcome by these horrible resentments, vindictiveness, protectionism, and oppressive impulses that make life miserable for so many people. I'm more open to the idea, after thinking about Rowe's writing, that there is a lot of potential in mindfulness, not just for the dreamy promise of epiphany, but for a kind of comfort that comes from reckoning with why we fear the things we fear.
I want you to start by talking about Radical Mindfulness, the book, in relationship to the kind of practice of writing, which I see your book is a little bit in that genre of auto theory, maybe. How did you develop that style? Where did that come from? All that kind of stuff. I'm just kind of curious about the feeling of writing the book, looking back.
Yeah, thanks for that lovely question. Yeah, like it is a personal book in lots of respects, in that sort of using my own, for better or worse, using my own sort of psyche, or access to whatever access I can gain to my own unconscious, to make sense of some of the patterning that I'm engaging in the larger world, and that I adhere to what Audre Lorde calls the sort of mythical norm, as a sort of middle class white guy, which is the demographic that in our part of the world has wreaked a lot of damage. And so really sort of looking inward, and tracking some of the ways that what I call a will to supremacy in the book has been very much alive in my own organism throughout my own personal history, and made me very uncomfortable at the times that it rears itself up to this day. Now it's largely in the form of sort of ego sometimes runs amok, versus some of the more political incarnations of that will to supremacy. But yeah, like really kind of using my own experience as a bit of a ground truthing. And for me, when I encountered the argument that a lot of dominative impulses and behavior originates in fear, that just really tracked with my own experience, that the times when I behave and have behaved poorly, it's often rooted in my own anxieties and fear. And so
Right.
that really, that's kind of what drew me to this set of thinkers that have really zeroed in on the role of existential fear in shaping a will to supremacy, because that just tracks with my own personal experience. And then likewise, in my experience with engaging with mind body practices that seek to metabolize some of our existential fear and anxiety, I've likewise sort of felt a lifting of that will to supremacy. Not to say that I've eradicated it by any stretch of the imagination, but I felt a lifting of that through these very practices. And so then that also shows me, or has helped show me, that okay, like uh, these practices have value, and they work. It's not to say that just because they work for me, they're going to work equally for everybody, but sort of consistently using my own experience as grist, I guess. And so that's where some of the autobiography shows up in the text. And then, I guess at a stylistic level, I just find storytelling engaging to read, and so as much as I could include it in the text itself was motivation.
Yeah, I personally really liked your prose in those sections. Like I thought something kind of happened in those pages that was really interesting. Where at the end of one paragraph you hit on the idea of um, a path that perpetuated instead of stopped cycles of violence. And there's just so much emotion bound up, I think, in that feeling of missed opportunities for ethical relationships between self and other. Basically, I mean, this is maybe why for me the book resonates with my experience of graduate school, because when I was in the English and Cultural Studies program at McMaster, it was sort of Levinas and Derrida time. And there was a lot of talk of alterity, and that was sort of what was in fashion. I remember having these kind of sly conversations with people on the side about, like, this is just what's in fashion, right? And it did sort of feel like people were trading in this concept of otherness, the other. But that was only true because of superficial reading that was happening that didn't really tie these concepts to a history of, you know, decolonization struggle and social movements that are really were the genesis of many of these ideas that are oppositional and insurgent. And I think deracinating that has been really undone in some places within the academy, but I think it lives on in others. And this is basically a long and winding way of asking you the question of where the book you think lands on this sort of problem of universality, right? Because you do deploy certain ideas of universality. You talk about universal cultural forms that are gathered from the same source, from a present minded encounter with the fullness of reality or the flow of impermanence. Despite finitude, you say, or perhaps even because of it, there is a richness to life. You see this really reverberating through a lot of cultures to the point where you can make the claim that it's a universal thing, right?
um, yeah, there's ways that there are sort of bids for a universal in the text that are out of fashion with some of the sort of postmodern or post-structural thinkers that you just mentioned, for sure. Yeah, I've definitely been inspired by um, non-Western universalisms. Whether it's sort of indigenous accounts of the human, or Buddhist accounts of the human. And so we tend to think, there's a line in one of Foucault's texts where he basically aligns universalism with imperialism, and of course there's good reason to make that link within Euro-American history, but I think we're at a loss if we think that any claim to common experience is fundamentally dominative. I don't buy
Mm,
that. I think that there's ways to account for the human experience in ways that aren't necessarily seemingly imposing the particular onto the universal. And for me,
mm,
especially when we look at peoples who have created cultural technologies to quell some of their existential fears and anxieties that would then dull the compensatory will to supremacy that might lead them to want to impose their view onto others. Uh, then I think that some of the universalisms that emerge from those cultures are maybe a bit less worrisome or dangerous than some of the
Mm.
universalisms that we perhaps encounter in Euro-American philosophical history. And so, there are counts or bids to the universal that I want to hold on to, and that death is experienced so differently across cultures. So of course I'm make a very it's very much an argument rooted in culture and how culture affects how we encounter finitude. And yet
Hmm.
finitude is something that we just can't escape across culture. It's not like
Hmm.
one culture's figured out how to bypass
Right.
that element of human experience. And then likewise,
Hmm.
I find it fascinating that there's Buddhist teachings that root back thousands of years from a completely other continent that map onto my own experience of my own sort of first person phenomenology in terms of how I
Right.
encounter existence. And so
Yeah.
it suggests to me that there's something going on there that's able to cross time and space, and that there is elements of human experience that are human, that are shared. And it's not to say that it isn't always mediated by language and by cultural difference, and yet for me, there's elements to our existence that we can speak to. And so, an existential outlook is one that I appreciate, and that it accounts for the fact that phenomena like love, death, birth, these are things that are shared universally across the human landscape. And now, of course, always mediated by language and culture, but there's a substance there that has some universal permeates throughout the human condition. So I think we were able to speak to the universal without always being a whisper away from domination.
Well said, of course. I mean that this comes. People should know this comes out of the kind of deep reflection that you've done in the book on this problem. It's not like you just deploy these ideas without really kind of trying to problematize them. And for me, I have that sort of. I don't think I've gone as deep into experimenting with these cosmologies, but I have to say I'm obviously attracted to these cultural practices that are ecstatic and about kind of epiphany. That to me is extremely interesting. I was listening to the Left of Black episode with Aishan Crawley, the author of Black Pentecostal Breath and other books, talking about praise breaks in the Black church as these moments of kind of um, a vibrating access of the ecstatic that has to be collective. It has to have music. It has to have these characteristics, right? Like material things that are about that specific place, But it doesn't. It is not without connection to these other broader notions of what is good and what is worth praising, and love, as you say, these universal ideas. So I do think like I'm sympathetic to that. I think it's really beautiful. But the other side of it is the drum major instinct. Martin Luther King Jr.'s concept of sort of individual competition, a kind of competitive individualism, however you want to frame it, that you just put it in the book, like, could it potentially be universal? And yeah, like I don't think you land on the notion that it is, but you do interestingly bring up the notion of the drum major instinct or a will to supremacy as a thing that undermines social movements. Like you say that there's a kind of, I think, specifically liberal, perhaps, enthusiasm for punishment that makes social movements hard places to be. You connect that directly to the drum major instinct. I just wondered if you wanted to expand on that, maybe in relationship to what you experienced at Occupy. Your experience at Occupy clearly was very positive, but this aspect of it maybe was a thing that emerged there. I don't know if you want to speak to any of those threads.
Yeah. Like part of the argument in the book is that before there's a sort of preceding energetic substance that uh, kind of pre-exists its funneling into specific dominations, whether along the axis of race, class, gender, species, or around just ego moves within the context of social movements. And Martin Luther King calls this the drum major instinct or desire to be out front of the parade. He locates it in our first cry as a child, which is a cry for attention in his phrasing. Um, and for me, I'm less committed to it being an instinct, something that is just sort of inherent, biologically wired
Mhm.
into us, that we just sort of have to work towards redirecting because we can't really undo it. For me, I do think it's more of a learned habit that we can undo, but I do think that it's a a compensatory move that runs commonly across the human experience. And so that's a key argument in the book, is that all domination is, well, maybe not all, but most domination is compensatory. It's making up for something. uh,
Mhm.
and for me, it's making up for anxieties, a whole layering of anxieties. It's not just death anxiety. There's other anxieties that people are compensating for when they're acting out on others and trying to make themselves big as a way of dealing with the smallness that they feel in the face of whatever particular
Mhm.
anxiety they might be
Mhm.
relating to, whether death anxiety or not. But um, yeah, but there's this will to supremacy that then we conjure up as a way of dealing with our anxieties, and then it can funnel into, depending on circumstance, into oppressions along the axis of race, class, gender, as I said. But even in movements that are seeking to undo those systemic oppressions, if we don't work with our subtle bodily energies, it's really easy for us to compensate for some of our own anxieties by imposing ourselves on those around us. And so there's ways that what on the left is referred to as call out culture has elements of that at work, where part of what's happening is that people are wanting to demonstrate their expert knowledge of the right phrasing or the right language, and maybe using it to put other people down, versus taking maybe a bit more of a pedagogic outlook, for like, oh, okay, you don't know the terminology that we're using to explain this. Why don't we help you understand? Versus
Mhm.
maybe wanting to lord over that person. And I catch myself doing this I found myself doing this a few times in debates over the recent election down south, where I think I'm feeling quite anxious about
Mhm.
what's happened, and I noticed myself wanting to be the smartest person in the room and explaining what
Right.
happened, and wanting to ensure that my analysis is represented at the top of the podium. And I'm like, fuck, I'm doing it again. And so I think that if we're not careful, that sort of that substance that can find its way into really ugly supremacist social relations that movements themselves are organized around fighting, that substance can
Mhm.
show up within movements themselves. Maybe not as racism per se, not to say that racism can't happen within social movements, it obviously can, but it can also just
Mhm.
show up in a kind of pettiness or egoic, aggrandizing behavior, where someone is wanting to just lord themselves over others with their expert use of terminology or inside knowledge or gossip or whatever else. But it really has a corrosive effect on movements. It makes them not very friendly places to be.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that I wanted to ensure that in talking about a will to supremacy, that it wasn't just the political right that I was referring to. Like, obviously, especially in this current conjuncture, that's the primary concern and the primary focus. But this is a human thing, and it's something that cuts across the political spectrum. And I think there's ways that those of us on the left uh, have our own work to do to ensure that we're not replicating some of these dynamics within our movements and making them kind of unmagnetic, uncharismatic places to be, which then makes it hard for us to build the popular power needed to counter the resurgent radical right in the current moment.
Yeah. I would agree, and it brings us into kind of this ideologically messy place, but that's an okay place to be if it is generative. We can't continue on the path that we're on, the sort of neoliberal rot, as Cornel West calls it. There has to be some kind of a repair. And it's very, very difficult for reasons that, are multifaceted for sure. But I do like that, you're providing a little bit of a unified theory of domination that says, yeah, most of it's compensatory. So what does that change the way that you look at a giant gas guzzling SUV, or a truck with like a Trump banner sticking out the back? I bring that up because, my colleague Kara Daggett has this concept, petromasculinity, that is really about appealing to a desire for domination. I think especially among people that have experienced decline, relative decline over the last short while, right? You talk a lot about the wages of whiteness. Well, the wages of whiteness are not going as far as they have in previous, decades in the United States especially. But rather than seek solidarity, you see this kind of Mark Lamont Hill called it closing ranks around whiteness that's happening right now. And Trump seems to really be the embodiment of that kind of appeal of a certain petromasculinity, and it kind of it's tempting in this context to just sort of lose hope and say, yeah, James Baldwin is right. You talk about how Baldwin insisted all peoples were susceptible to political and existential resentments and compensatory violence. So in some sense, Baldwin is saying vindictiveness might be universal, and you're asking in the book, why does social injustice seem to be a permanent part of our lives? Need it be that way? Must my gain be your loss? Do I have to exist on the sort of island of wealth at your, expense? How can something like embodied social change, for example, be a strategy for kind of unsticking that?
Yeah, no, another great question. I think like one of the reasons why looking at dominative behavior as compensatory is so important to me is that it takes it out of the realm of pure evil, which makes it sort of irreconcilable. If someone's just pure evil, then they have to be destroyed. Whereas if you
Mm,
give them a predicament where actually they're seeking to make up for something, are they doing it in a sort of healthy and ennobling way? No, no, but it means that there's an opening for us to perhaps find some solidarity down the road. And so, I don't like the idea of giving up on our fellow humans. And so I do think that always holding the door open for possibility within reason, of course, within our individual lives. Sometimes there's conversations that have to end and relationships that might just have to end. We always have to make those
mm,
micro judgments, but I think ultimately, like from an absolute perspective, holding open the possibility for um, some kind of reconnection or resolution or solidarity is, I think, really important. And I think a compensatory understanding of domination does that for us because it asks, why are people behaving the way that they're behaving, and
yeah.
that question, I think, is really generative, and it does open up the possibility for compassion. Like, of course we should always have compassion for victims first of any kind of wrongdoing, but shouldn't we also have some compassion for perpetrators, if we're asking that question of why are they doing what they're doing, and if it is rooted in their own experience of pain and oppression and anxiety, then there's some healing that could happen there that would be not only good for them, but good for the rest of us, as well. And so I really like Baldwin's account of he sort of does this excavation of the white American psyche across his works. And, again, for him, white supremacy is compensatory, and he wants to understand all the different layers of what white Americans are compensating for. And at the surface, he finds just good old regular status anxiety, where if
Sure.
you're in a highly stratified capitalist society, if you're at the bottom of the economic ladder, you're going to find it reassuring to know that there's people below you. And for him, historically, that's been Black Americans, and that's one of the roles they've played.
Hmm.
And then, beneath that status anxiety, he finds sort of ancestral trauma, which is really quite fascinating. I don't think that gets accounted for enough. The ways that uh, racialization happened internally to Europe before it got exported, and colonialism happened internally to Europe before it got exported. And there's a huge amount of violence and pain and trauma that happened that was never effectively healed. And so if you've experienced belittlement in your ancestral history, being told suddenly that you're part of the superior race sounds pretty good. It sounds that sort of sounds like it offers some kind of healing, even though it's a poisonous olive branch. And then, of course, at the bottom of this pit of the white American psyche, he finds death anxiety that's being compensated for, that we need cultural
Mhm.
practices for transforming. And on those bottom two layers of sort of ancestral pain and wounds, and then our existential fears and anxieties, we need embodied practices that can speak to those parts of ourselves that don't always answer the call of cognitive reasoning or a policy
Mhm.
proposal. We need to find ways of accessing our unconscious realms and being able to instigate healing. And that's what mind body practices are designed to do. Now, when it comes to that initial status anxiety that Baldwin talked about, the best way to deal with that is precisely the kind of Bernie Sanders style economic populism that's been quashed by the Democratic Party over the last 8 years, which is what's facilitated the rise of Trump. And I do think that his vicious scapegoating of immigrants and of trans people, it's just like textbook scapegoating of allowing Americans who are really struggling economically to feel better than this subclass
Right.
of people that are
Yeah.
being derogated. But I do think that that kind of move is a lot less successful when you do have much higher levels of economic equality. It's not going to get rid of the compensatory attachments to supremacy, but it will quell them considerably. And so, for me, in the book and more broadly, like we meditation isn't going to solve all of our problems, but neither is sound policy, because I do think that a lot of our challenges are rooted in subtle bodily responses to ancestral trauma and to existential trauma. And until we start targeting some of aspects of our experience with practices that we don't typically think of as political, ritual, meditation, increasingly psychedelics in a ceremonial context,
Mhm.
um, these can be really powerful tools for not only improving our mental health, but for quelling some of our fears and anxieties that then provide just an endless stream of fuel to wills to supremacy along different axes, whether it's a white supremacy or it's just social movement actors taking out their pain on each other, trying to be at the front of the parade, as King suggested. And so that's why I think we
Mhm.
want to orient ourselves towards some of these fears and anxieties that haven't maybe been attended to as much as maybe they should.
Mhm. Yeah, and really lovely unpacking of the argument for an anti-racism that just I think is radically honest about the settler psyche. There's this moment in the book where you say um, this failure implanted belittlement and resentment at the psychic core of those who invented and rushed toward whiteness as a fantastical and destructive way to cope with their existential wounds. It really captures Trump and grievance nicely, actually, um, and gives us a little bit of a you know a key, I think, to understanding, um, yeah, the soul of this particular iteration of whiteness that really it obviously feels deeply threatened, and so tellingly is rushing toward an authoritarian version of whiteness. Um, but I want to try and make it a little bit about um, sweetness and light and epiphany and these feelings of awe that you're also describing, because like it seems to me that's where people find transformation more than feelings of shame and disgust and aversion and isolation, obviously. And you do say that like you've personally experienced these feelings of awe, feelings of the richness of the world like coursing through you, and that feeling um, is addictive, right? That desire for more of that kind of epiphany is real, and in a world that really attempts in many ways to stultify it, it can be in short supply. right? You're kind of just bombarded by cars and commercialism and all of these soulless things. Do you want to just sort of talk more about those experiences and how you sort of protect them in this built environment that isn't particularly concerned about feelings of awe and the richness of the world?
For me, at the absolute bottom core, when we get to sort of the bottom of the sort of psyche, as Baldwin describes, I agree with him that we find a lot of anxiety around death and a lot of um, discomfort with our existence as these finite beings on this planet that is quite mysterious. We don't understand why we're here. There's so much to this experience that is confusing. The philosopher Hegel referred to death as the absolute master, which would suggest that we're slaves in the face of it. And then we have cultural scripts in the Euro-American world. So I'm thinking particularly of original sin, where our punishment for eating from the tree of knowledge in Eden is to be tossed out into mortality. Mortality is seen as a punishment, and so there's ways that we walk around, I think, with a lot of cultivated resentment and fear around our embodied existence as fleshly beings on this earth. And uh, there's this beautiful offering that the Buddhist teacher Chogyam Trungpa developed in his teachings of Buddhism in the West, which is basic goodness. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a very easily sort of maybe misunderstood concept because it just seems a little bit maybe saccharine, but basically arguing that if we look at existence in its totality, including death, there's a fundamental goodness to life on earth. There's a fundamental generosity to life on earth. And I think that we are starving in this part of the world for stories, like the story of basic goodness, and then mind body practices for embodying that basic goodness so that we can have a different benchmark of or a different baseline in terms of our existential experience, where we encounter the world not as threatening, but as something that we're a part of. Like we're deeply imbricated in it, and the generosity of the earth is alive within our own organism. We're capable of acting with the same generosity that allows us to live full lives. And so I think that we need more of that in this part of the world. Robin Kimmerer and Braden Sweetgrass talks about, despite all the differences across Indigenous nations on Turtle Island, they all share a culture of gratitude, she says. And I think that that's
Mm-hmm.
something that we're missing in settler society in this part of the world, is cultures of gratitude for the richness of existence. The Sunday comes from an old English word, Sunendag, which literally means the sun's day. So we think about Sunday now as a Christian day of the Lord, but originally it was a day for honoring that huge ball of energy in the sky that bestows us with a massive amount of energy that makes all of earthly life possible. And so there's a generosity coursing through earthly life, and even death itself is part of that, where when we die, our energetics feeds into new life. And so there's a fundamental generosity to our existence here. And so the more that I think that we can tell stories that open our eyes to that reality, not denying that there is pain and that there is suffering, and that death is hard, but if we just look at it in its totality, there's a fundamental generosity or goodness to it. And then to develop practices that allow us to see for ourselves if we agree or not. And that's what meditation is designed to do, is to just sit with our breathing body. As the minutes pass, we encounter our finitude. There's just such sort of metaphorical richness between that space between in breath and out breath. It's the space between present and future and life and death, and we can sit with that while meditating. And it is my experience that these practices can unlock encounters with awe and with wonder that aren't available when we're walking around really restricted and afraid. because the narratives that we've been taught are that this is a scary world. We are small slaves in the face of death. And the best we can kind of do is by fantastically compensating for those anxieties by imposing ourselves on others and get little dopamine hits of power from that. But we actually don't need to go that route. We can encounter some of that awe and wonder just by slowing down and sitting with the intensity of existence. And so yeah, I would like there to be more opportunity for more people to encounter that. And part of it's around, making these practices more available, but then of course also around changes in social policy where we have a shorter work week, where there's more time to engage in these kinds of practices as well. So yeah, I guess in try not to go on too much longer, I'll put a pin in it there.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. I mean, you mentioned so many things that I want to pick up on. One is the reference to the sun, the promise of renewable energy being the primary way that we're going to kind of divorce ourselves from these these death dealing fuels, these really entrenched infrastructures of poison that have been naturalized. And I want to ask you a question about climate change in relationship to acceptance of finitude, of impermanence, because I see a kind of almost a paradoxical thing happening. The thing you're advocating opens up this feeling of kind of intergenerational love and responsibility, a feeling almost, I won't call it debt, but a belief that it's important to leave the world sort of better than maybe you entered it, and to think about leaving the world as a kind of component of your relationship to justice, to social justice. And that would, opening that up, unlocking that would be an incredible, windfall for the climate movement, for people to kind of really start to love in those longer durations. But the other thing about it is it seems to also open onto a certain acquiescence to climate impacts, which are coming, whether we like it or not, right? I mean, we're talking about a meter at least of sea level rise by 2100, and the kind of disappearance of whole communities. We've already seen the beginnings of that level of mass sacrifice, effectively. And your book actually ends with a description of a dream that you had in 2018 of wildfires, which were these apocalyptic events that felt like a dream for a lot of people. Um, you know, can you kind of unpack what you realized in relationship to that dream about denying the reality of death in relationship to kind of climate impacts? And do you think our politics have been a little bit scrambled by that paranoid fear of climate impacts and the death that they bring?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really rich question. And so, yeah, always need to distinguish between existential acceptance and political acceptance. And so I'm advocating
Mm,
for existential acceptance of our fleshly, finite lives as human beings on this planet, and developing practices for cultivating gratitude for the lives that we have. But I'm not advocating for political acquiescence or acceptance. And in fact, the
mm.
reverse, that the more that we can accept our existential condition, the more capacity I think we have to effectively combat some of the political injustices that we face. And so, I'll just maybe talk about the category of climate anxiety, because that's maybe gets at some of the tensions that you're asking about. Like, I think that climate
Mm-hmm.
anxiety is a very humane uh, and often non-neurotic grieving uh, of the damage that's been wrought to this beautiful home of ours by fossil capitalism. And and I think that it's really important for us to make space for that grieving. I do think that there are ways that some of the anxieties that show up within the environmental movement can be a little bit neurotic, and that I think that we might want to attend to, even if we just look at the language in the environmental movement of like sustainability, like sustain, where we're trying to keep something alive and conservation, wanting to again uh, maintain when there's cycles, like things don't, not everything can sustain. Things die, and things end, and that reality, I think that some of the death anxiety that's alive in the broader culture is also alive in the environmental movement. Even phrases like "save the planet," which I understand, but it imposes a certain fragility onto this robust, incredibly powerful planet that we're on, where we need saving. It doesn't need saving, and so I do think that there are some neuroticisms that are alive within the environmental movement. And I think that the more that we can accept finitude existentially, the more energy will rouse for being able to, out of love for the totality of existence, including death, we'll have more energy and capacity and resource to challenge many of the social and political structures that are facilitating undue premature death for multiple species, and possibly even including some, well, already including a number of us due to climate change. And so it is paradoxical, but I think that accepting death and change at a fundamental level actually gives us energy and power to combat the premature imposition of death by these systems and structures.
That's, yeah, really, really helpful kind of, uh, uh, examination of the core idea, right? That there's something to be preserved about mindfulness if it is brought into contact with the radical prefix. This is so crucial for the book. I like that you say that that prefix is particularly important at a moment where mindfulness is kind of zeitgeisty, where it's in danger of really being completely inoculated in its potential for really shifting people in their neuroplasticity into a place where they can consider a break from the kind of individualistic race to the bottom norm that we are in. Um, I think I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of talk either personally or politically or philosophically about that problem, I guess, of appropriation, which you can say largely happens when meditation teachers erase the Buddhist origins of particular practices. So I don't know if you wanted to talk about like the origin side of it, preserving that, or the kind of where it's coming from, the corporate boardrooms that the commodification of mindfulness is emanating from.
Yeah, no, I think as you say, like the radical prefix is important, given what Ron Purser calls Mick mindfulness, which is mindfulness deployed in a sort of system maintaining way versus a systems changing way, where it really locates responsibility on the individual, where it's sort of your fault that you're feeling a lot of stress and anxiety, and you're going to be the locus of solution versus larger structural change. And so, definitely joining Purser in wanting to criticize that mobilization of mind body practice, and and instead really emphasize their fundamentally transformative role, which I do think is more aligned with their original development within particularly the Buddhist context that I examine. But something I also engage with in the book is that Buddhism itself is a site of politics and conflict, and there is no sort of originary Buddhism that is inherently social justice oriented. Like that's been fought over within the tradition itself. You can find resources within Buddhism that point towards justice, and others that are a bit more conservative. And so, ultimately arguing that these practices need to be joined with conventional politics if we are going to realize the full potential of both conventional politics and mind body practices. And I tell the story of the Buddha's aunt Mahaprajapati in the book, because I think it helps reveal some of these dynamics where, after the Buddha was enlightened, his aunt, who actually raised him because his birth mother died shortly after his birth, is all according to story. uh, she asked him if she could join his monastic community, and he said no. And this is after enlightenment. It's like, no, you're not allowed. And it actually, long story short, required a protest basically on her behalf to get herself and other women allowed into the monastic community. And this sort of just helps clarify that these practices, these mind-body practices by themselves, don't inherently result in just outcomes. They need to be combined with protest in the way that Mahaprajapati advocated for herself and others. But we can look to back in that time that arguably the fact that he was, I guess, quote unquote, enlightened, maybe did undo some of the Buddha's defensive tendencies, because he did cut against the grain of his time by allowing women into the monastic communities, deeply patriarchal society. Patriarchy persists into this day, of course, but very heavily sedimented patriarchal systems and values then that the Buddha did end up, pushing against, but he needed to be encouraged to do so through protest. And so I think for me, it's an example of how these practices can work together. Mind-body practices undo some of our defensive tendencies, open us up to more generous affects and outcomes. But by themselves, they're not going to promote justice and flourishing. We still need our protest and our policy engagements as well, because there's multiple drivers of dominated behavior. It's not just existential fear, but existential fear is an important one that hasn't been attended to enough, which is why I do think embodiment practices are so important. But again, the intention behind the embodiment practice is so important. And if our intention is to make more money and to be more efficient, then that's not going to have much yield. Whereas if our intention is around fundamental self and system transformation, then that's what the technique will offer. So I do think that the way they get deployed really matters.
For sure. And the book is such a helpful tool for thinking through all of these things. So I mean, if you're a person that's really compelled by these problems, which can feel, I think, pretty heady and pretty big, the book, like I say, is a really helpful resource, because you're giving us challenging stuff. Of course, the notion of a death positivity movement is itself challenging the almost fundamental association between death and negativity, negation, and you're combining that with these rich descriptions of like existential affirmation and these what I see as almost ecstatic or epiphanal states. But at the same time, what really seems to drive you is that notion of what you call collective bids for justice, and how they can be, I think, strengthened by these other practices that you found value in. So yeah, thanks so much for writing the book, for making time to talk to me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Thank you so much, Scott. This is a real treat. I really appreciate it.